information and practical application guidance to you. Again, it doesn't replace any direction or other training that you receive from your county emergency management in the area of sheltering. We're going to focus specifically on hurricane pre-storm evacuation sheltering. Red Cross is primarily engaged in post-storm or what we call no-notice events like large apartment fires, wildfires, those type of things. But again, we utilize the schools because they are built to the specifications for hurricane evacuation. We're going to provide you, hopefully, with some practical knowledge from a general perspective that you can use across a wide spectrum of agencies active in shelters. We're going to talk about what is a hurricane evacuation center and what is not provided. Now, I think this picture kind of sums it up. Evacuation centers versus what we call a recovery shelter, which is longer term. You'll see in the evacuation, it's bare bones, as open and wide as possible so that you can have as many evacuees and many people in there as possible. It is as I said, a lifeboat. It is not a cruise ship. If you date yourself, it's not the Love Boat. It is to get away from the hazard and the threat as long as the hazard and the threat is there. In a recovery or a longer term sheltering, that's when we pull out the cots, we get people more comfortable, we have more comfort items available, but evacuation centers are bare bones, and the messaging your county is going to send to people is that that's what they should expect. So your role is basically to provide them a safe place to get away from the storm. Now, our topics today, we're going to talk about the core functions in shelters, and you may be performing one of those roles in a shelter, and we'll talk about which ones those are. We'll talk about a little bit about setting up the shelter, which will be directed by the shelter managers, which are the principals or the administrators for the school. They'll do a lot of the heavy setup, getting things ready for that. They have their crews ready and prepared to do that. Critical function is registration. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about that. What do you do while you're operating a shelter? What kind of issues and challenges you're going to encounter, and your plan for closing the shelter. Again, if you have any questions, just put them in the chat, and I'll pause every so often. Has there been any questions as yet?
No, sir. You're all good to go.
Okay. The first thing that I would advise you is you need to prepare yourself for this assignment. You need to prepare yourself mentally, emotionally, and understand that this is a challenging assignment. Anytime you put a whole bunch of people under one roof and they're sharing toilet facilities, you're going to have challenges, just hard. This is a stressful time. It's a stressful time for you. It's a stressful time for the residents of the shelter. So you have to go into this understanding that. Also understand that at some point you're going to be in that shelter until it's safe to leave. And if you're on a shift, at some point you may be called in prior to the storm impacting the area and have to be in that shelter because you can't do shift change while the wind is blowing. So you may be in there getting some rest, supporting others prior to your time on shift. You need to have your own supplies to bring with you. This includes any meds or special dietary needs that you may have. You should prepare a go kit with a change of clothes, toiletries, your medications, comfort items, anything that you may need for that time period. Now, hurricane evacuation shelters, centers are a little different than most of those. Again, it's primarily for people to get away from the threat. And so there's a timeline. There's usually a 120-hour timeline that EM uses to start looking and planning. About 72 hours out, some decisions get made. But sometimes the track changes, and suddenly you're not in the cone. You're suddenly in the cone when you weren't in the cone. And so you have to be flexible and take that in consideration. And I know part of the plan there in Pasco is to keep staff informed and to give them as much notice as possible, but there's always the possibility things can change. Now, general population shelter is open to anyone in the public. Anybody can come and take shelter. But the types of folks who come to shelters are folks that don't have any other option. Most folks, if they have to evacuate an area, will go to friends and family in adjacent places that are outside of the impact area. They'll take a mini vacation if they have the means to do so. But that leaves folks that are, for instance, homeless. Obviously, they have significant threat if they're out there in the open. Folks that are in precarious housing situations. For instance, they were living with family and friends, but they can't live there anymore because the storm's approaching and there's just not enough room. Folks that don't have the means to get their own hotel rooms or the gas to get out of the area. And that goes into people with disabilities and the elderly. Of course, it's a stressful environment and you need to prepare yourself for that. Now, a resource available to you that I know the county has is a checklist that we call the Shelter Field Guide. And it breaks down sheltering into core functions. And I've got a picture of it there, but it has a checklist for each one of these functions and what you're supposed to do. Management, that's taken care of by the school board, but it's important to note that someone must be in charge of a shelter. That seems self-evident, but often, especially working with volunteers, there are people reluctant to take that responsibility on or to shrug it off to somebody else. But the administrators, the school board will provide an administrator per facility to be the shelter manager. The other is reception. You may be asked, and that could start all the way out in the parking lot as people come in, directing people into the shelter, directing them to the registration desk, answering questions. And that we call it the good hello. If we start with a good hello, that often helps alleviate a lot of issues later on. Dormitory registration. We'll talk about the registration a little bit later, but every household that comes in has a registration form. Every individual, if it's just a single individual, they're a household and they have a registration form. The registration area has to be maintained the entire time. There's going to be times that there are surges, initially when you open and then a few hours before the impact of the storm. Information, getting information out to shelter residents. We recommend you set up a table with with brochures or any information, the use of the PA system to give announcements on the progress of the storm or information about services. Dormitory operation. Again, we don't have cots out there, but folks will be assigned areas. And it's good to have people just walk those areas, check on things, talk to residents, just helping maintain a calming atmosphere. Feeding operations, that's taken care of by the school board and their cafeteria staff. But in COVID, feeding is going to look a little different. Talk about that later. And then if you have partners that can provide you, like the health department or EMTs with health services, it's good to have those folks in the shelters to take care of medical situations. If you have partners that can provide you with chaplains, spiritual care, mental health professionals, those are great assets to have in the shelter. You may not always have that though, but it's a great thing to have. And then security will be provided by your law enforcement partners. You will have law enforcement at every one of those shelters, and we'll talk a little bit about what their functions are. So if you don't have a copy of the Shelter Field Guide, I'd suggest you request one from County EM, and they will get you one and make yourself familiar with it. It has the checklist and things that you need to know about what it is you're supposed to do. Any questions on that?
I just am going to add in there, Steve, that everybody will receive a shelter field guide with their certifications upon completion of the course.
Excellent. Now, setting up a shelter, this is the fictional James Madison High School. But each one of the schools has their own floor plan, and the administrators are familiar with it. They know what the usable square feet is in each area, and they will direct you as to what areas we set up and where. It's important in setting up a shelter to understand that there needs to be one way in and one way out, and that any other exits that are there have to be covered by staff. We do this so that everybody goes through registration and you can maintain a count of how many people are in that shelter. And it's very important to maintain the count because at a certain point, if the shelter starts to get full or to capacity, and that's usually around 70 to 75%, the county will give you a call as to consider opening up additional shelters if they get full. All right, registration. The form that I have here is our Red Cross registration form. I'm going to talk about some but the Pasco County one is very similar, and they all pretty much collect the same kinds of information. It has to be completed during the initial registration. Forms need to be stored securely, and only staff should have access to them. Now, one of the things that we recommend is to use the residents to help you out in certain areas, and they can be used to help with cleaning, with information dissemination, perhaps some feeding activities. But the one thing they cannot have access to is registration. So you can't use client residents to help you with this because this is confidential and on a need to know. But it is important to have this registration on every household, and it serves as the basic document to show who is in that shelter. So if later on there is any claim or an issue, or we need to know who was there and when did they come and that type of thing, this is the document that shows that. So they have to be secure, and the registration people need to keep on top of them and keep them in a secure binder, a folder, whatever the system is. Now, in our form, we guide you through the first thing. We ask that our registration folks just do an observation of the family, and if you see any noticeable needs, particularly like what we call functional access needs, mobility, if somebody's in a wheelchair, if somebody's using a walker, do they look like they need some additional assistance? We're going to talk a little bit about service animals later on. You know, do they have a service animal? And then we ask questions. Is there anything you or a member of your family need right now to stay healthy while in the shelter? Is there anything you know you will need in the next 6 to 8 hours? And that's a good opportunity. Some folks, again, if it's early on, if they've forgotten medication, that's a good time to send them back to go get their medication. You know, we ask them if they have any health, mental health, or disability or other conditions which you are concerned about. Again, if there's any kind of accommodation that has to be made. Some folks need to be closer to the bathroom. Some folks need to be closer to doors, whatever. This is where you ask those questions. I think somebody just put a question in the chat.
There's no questions entered in the chat, Steve. They're just entering some last minute attendance records.
Okay, I'm sorry. Something flashed on my screen there.
Oh, there actually is one now. It
Okay.
says, what happens if a resident refuses to complete a registration form? So that's kind of a sticky one. I'll let Steve let us explain what the Red Cross would do.
We would have a conversation. It probably would get escalated to like a supervisor or a manager to explain why we need this information. This is also the basis. We use it as a basis to assist us in determining people's needs so that we can coordinate services for them. And again, it's a record to show that they were in a shelter. Now, there are occasionally post-storm programs that will serve people who were in shelters. And if they need that documentation to show that they were in a shelter, that's where that record is at. So it's to their benefit to do it. And then ultimately, if that just is absolute refusal, it would depend on the situation. If it's during the storm, and we're not going to send somebody out, obviously, into the storm. We're going to keep them. We're going to keep them observed. We're going to bring our law enforcement partners in a little bit, and hopefully that would resolve it at that point. But if it's a time where things are safe, we require that they have a registration. If they're not going to fill that out, we tell them, well, then take shelter somewhere else. But again, if it's during the storm and it's too dangerous to send them away, we're just going to keep them and observe them and kind of restrict their movements. Krista, you got anything to add on that?
So that's pretty much what we do here as well. It is very important, and Steve will touch base on it a little bit as to why the registration is needed, especially because we do have law enforcement up front screening individuals as they come in to see if anybody's a registered sex offender. So unless the storm is directly impacting at that moment, we're following the same guidelines that the Red Cross just mentioned.
All right. Again, registration is filled out per household. So if a person comes in, or if a family or a household, however they present themselves, if they're a group of people, then you fill out one for the group. If there's more people than there's lines for, you get a blank piece of paper or you put their names on the back, and work it that way. Again, if it's, so if it's a group of 4, that's 1 registration. If it's 4 individuals, that's 4 registrations. We collect some things like, method of transportation, because that helps us. I'll back up. Primary language, English, Spanish, whatever they speak. It helps us to know what they came in, so that we can start planning. For instance, if people are taking public transportation primarily to the shelters, then that's good for your emergency management to know, so they can make plans about transportation, getting folks out of the shelter. If it's primarily vehicles, then we ask them to give us their plate, make and model. And then again, we list their names and their departure dates. And then there's 3 questions in here that get to some sensitive areas. One is someone in your household required by law to register with the state or local government agency? That includes people that are on probation, parole, or registered sex offenders. If the answer to that question is yes, then that needs to get elevated over to the law enforcement representative you have there at the shelter, and then they will screen them and determine what's the best place for them to shelter at. In your county, those that are registered sex offenders are given notice where they can go shelter. I believe that's at the jail facility. They're not put in the general population. They stay in administrative areas, but that's where they're told to go. And your law enforcement folks will be screening those folks and directing them. Now, again, at a certain point, if there is a threat, imminent threat to life outside because of the wind and the rain, you may have to accommodate those folks, segregate them from the general population, have somebody watch them until it's safe for them to leave. We also collect whether they are a veteran, again, largely to sea, or active military, largely to sea, because post-storm there may be programs and benefits they are entitled to. And we also ask them to share their information with other agencies post providing disaster relief services. This allows us to tell their story to other agencies. And then they sign attesting that it is true and accurate what they've said. Again, you have your own registration form, but it's very similar. So I'll take at this point any questions on the subject.
So we do have a couple of questions. We have the first one being, how do you know if they have firearms with them? Steve, do you want to address how you guys handle that, and then I'll touch base with Pasco?
Well, it's a self-disclosure. We post our rules, and that there are no weapons allowed. When we'll talk a little bit about drugs and other things. How do we know? We don't have scanners at the front, so it's a self-disclosure. If they tell you they do have weapons, we ask them to take those weapons and put them in their vehicle, or how they came. If they don't, they came on public transportation or some other means, or walked, then we work that through law enforcement to see if there's a way that they can secure their weapons with them.
That's the same thing here in Pasco. There is another question that says, do pocket knives count as weapons? Yes, they do. We consider any kind of object that can be used to inflict danger upon someone else as a weapon. The next question is, do we have forms available in other languages, Spanish especially? Yes, we do have the forms in other languages, primarily Spanish. I do not think we have them in any other language. And I do know that there are a couple people throughout the shelter who will be bilingual. And if there's nobody specifically at that given shelter, we do have bilingual individuals here in the EOC who are available for translations.
All right. Now, while ongoing shelter operations, the clients need obviously access to the shelter area and the services provided. For instance, we have snack tables and feeding areas. Now, with COVID, that gets a little bit dicey. A lot depends on what the guidance is at the time. Some of those services might not be available because you don't want people congregating. They need to feel safe, secure, and comfortable. A large part of that is going to be if they see an organized effort on your part and the management, they'll feel more safe and secure. Obviously, we want to treat everyone with respect. We want people to stay with the people they came from. They normally do. But particularly in COVID, you're going to have them spread apart a little bit more and stick to themselves. They need to be involved in decisions for themselves and family, and part of that is keeping them informed in the shelter with updates about what's going on outside, what the transition plans are, if there's going to be post-storm shelters after the storm is there, and can they take shelter there if they can't go back to their homes. Sometimes they might be absent a family member and trying to work with your law enforcement partners if they're trying to locate people. We all have systems in place too that we can take a referral and try to do reunification and locate folks for them. But at a certain time in the storm, there may be folks that they're worried about that didn't make it to the shelter, or they don't know where a family or loved one is. And lastly, I'll just say, how would you want a family member or yourself to be treated if you had to be in a shelter? So we have a saying in the Red Cross, be relentlessly kind. That is tough to do sometimes in a stressful environment with people who are stressed out and angry. But the best that you can is to keep that in mind, that I'm going to be kind, I'm going to be respectful, and hopefully, and most of the time, residents will respond to that. Now, general population shelters, everyone is welcome. No one gets turned away. It is appropriate to try to shelter people with special needs or other things in another place. And we talked about people in certain categories like sex offenders and things like that. But everyone is welcome as a public shelter, and no one gets turned away. So anybody could show up. And certainly they're not discriminated against by race, creed, sexual orientation, or anything else like that. Any questions on that?
There is one question in the chat box that says, are masks mandatory in the shelter? At this time, we cannot mandate masks inside. However, it is going to be strongly encouraged, and we are going to have masks on hand. And if anything changes, we'll let you guys know upon activating a shelter.
Yeah. I will share that our Red Cross managed shelters, as it stands right now, we are going to have masks for all residents and all staff in an abundance of caution, but that guidance keeps getting updated. So I think a lot's going to depend on what is the COVID situation at the time. Follow your emergency management guidance in any case. Now, there are going to be issues in managing a shelter. A lot of it has to do with just human interaction. People are people. So you're going to have people that are behaving inappropriately. There may be folks who show up with unrealistic expectations. Maybe they were expecting the cruise ship and they are totally disappointed in the level of service at the shelter. There may be disagreements among clients, and there may be disagreements among staff. Um, Getting accurate information to people. It's important to communicate, but it's also important not to share any information that has not been vetted, understanding that disasters are fluid environments and things change. But unless you know for sure, it's much better to say, I don't know, but I'll find out, than to guess. And then obviously, if the staff themselves are not working as a team, things seem to be disorganized, the residents pick up on that. So the better poorly, the more, uh, excuse me, the more organized you are, the better the clients will be in response to that. And individually, I can't emphasize enough, be flexible. Every disaster is different. They throw you different curveballs. You can plan, but there's always going to be the unexpected. Were there questions that came up in the chat?
Yes. One question is, will there be medical personnel on site? Yes, there will be. There will be 2 members from fire rescue at each shelter. On top of that, the special needs shelters will be more equipped with more medical personnel, and occasionally they have volunteer nurses on staff. The next question is, are all shelters pet friendly? And the answer to that is no. We have a select amount of shelters that are pet friendly. However, in the instance of when individuals have dogs or miniature ponies, which Steve will go over, that are considered service animals, those are an exception. But no, not all shelters are pet friendly.
Which brings us into the next slide. Animals. Service animals are welcome at all general population shelters. Service animals are animals that are trained to help a person with a disability, and they, again, are always allowed in shelters. However, the resident does not have to show you any credentials or proof or a license or anything like that to show that it is a service animal. But legally, you can ask a couple of questions to determine if it is or it isn't. Now, one I'll go into. By statute in Florida, a service animal is either a dog or a miniature pony. I am always mystified about the miniature pony, but that's what the law says. So if it isn't a dog and if it isn't a miniature pony, then it's not a service animal. So cats, weasels, ferrets, exotic animals of any kind are not service animals. But let's say it's a dog and you're trying to determine if it is a service animal or it's not a service animal. You can ask these 2 questions. You can ask, is the animal required because of a disability? You can't ask what the disability is, but you can ask, is it required because of a disability? If they say yes, you go to question number 2. If what work or task has the animal been trained to perform? And then they're supposed to describe what that service animal does for them. If they're not trained to provide specific functions, then they are either an assistance animal, which is like emotional support animals, or just comfort animals, or they're pets. Our policy is they should not be in general population shelters. And there are pet-friendly shelters that are designated in the county for people to go to. They're generally required to bring their own food for their pet, their own crates, although usually Animal Services has some supplies there on hand. And they're required to be there and stay and take care of their animal. And one note on service animals, that the handler or the owner of that animal is still responsible to care for and feed and keep that animal under control. So, any questions on service animals?
There is a question. One question says, "Do you need to see paperwork to see if they are a service animal?"
No, they are, the owner is not required to provide you with any uh, documentary evidence that they are a service animal. But if you have questions whether it is or it is not, and you can't go buy those little vests, you can order those online, and anybody can buy one and put them on their pet. But if you have a question of whether this is a service animal or not, you can ask the two questions that are there. Is this required because of a disability? And then what is this animal been trained to do for you?
The
And
next
then that,
question in the chat, Steve, says, "I have a service dog. Will I be allowed to bring him with me?"
yes, in our shelters, if someone has a service animal that fits the criteria, then yes, they would be allowed to bring their service animal with them.
To
I
add on
prefer
to
to,
that, if you do have a disability that may hinder your ability to assist and provide aid in the shelter, you might want to reach out to Human Resources to see if you can get an exemption form and fill that out. Otherwise, if you feel completely comfortable and confident working within a shelter, then you're completely okay to have your service pet.
all right, law enforcement issues. We've talked about sex offenders. Weapons are not allowed in the shelter. And again, I had to take the guidance from your emergency management on what constitutes it, but we do not allow weapons in our shelters. There may be instances where you will have unaccompanied minors, persons under the age of 18. Often it's an older teen with a bunch of siblings. Mom said, I'll get to the shelter when I get off work, but you guys go ahead and go. If that occurs, you need to get your law enforcement partners involved. Somebody needs to be assigned to those kids to observe them until that parent is located. Drug use, if it's illegal outside the shelter, it's illegal inside the shelter. Okay. Violence or verbal escalations, obviously, if residents start to get into it with each other, that's why your law enforcement partners are there. All right, COVID. I'm going to talk about COVID and COVID procedures in the shelter. Last year at Red Cross, we post-storm and in the areas that we operated, we put people up in hotels as much as we could. But there are times that you can't avoid that. Evacuation sheltering is probably one of those times because you can't put people up in hotels that you don't know if they're rated. There's also the issue of availability of hotels because the general public buys up a whole lot of those. So what I'm going to tell you is really situationally dependent. Um, it's also dependent upon what resources you have because you may not have everything that you need. In any respect, if you're doing congregate sheltering in a COVID environment, uh, you need to have consideration for distancing, for cleanliness, for masks, uh, to limit risk to both yourself and your workforce. There's a lot of on this slide, but I'm going to just try to summarize it for you. In our scheme, we recommend that there be a screening area outside of the shelter before they ever get inside of the building where health screening questions are done and there are temperature checks. That, of course, does require more people. We have trained just general volunteers in doing that screening and doing the temperature checks. If you have health certified folks that can do that, that's probably better. But that isolation, that screening area should be separate and away from the registration area before people get in the building. And then second, there should be an isolation area for anyone that is presenting symptoms or say that they have been exposed. That's a separate area that needs to be staffed, we recommend, by health services persons. Again, much will depend on the situation at the time, whether this is going to be necessary or not. This is just kind of a flow chart of how we set things up. Again, that screening is outside of the shelter. If they present symptoms, they go into the isolation area for shelter. If they don't, then, some jurisdictions have set up separate shelters for people who have COVID or are presenting with COVID. So you direct them much like to pet shelters or things like that. Now, the client flow in a shelter, they come through, they're screened, they go to registration. From there, they're assigned a space. Your administrator should have a plan on how people are assigned, what areas that you're going to fill up first, and where they're going to go. But that will be briefed to you at the time by the shelter manager. To the extent possible, we recommend that physical barriers between services and between people be erected, much like you see in restaurants today with the plastic between the booths and things like that, if those resources are available. Feeding in a COVID environment. We do not recommend any congregate feeding. That is cafeteria style where people sit down and have a meal. Much more of a grab and go situation. We have a food storage table with prepackaged meals of some kind. That could be MREs. Everybody stays gloved, everybody stays masked. You place the food on the delivery table. The resident or the household picks up their meals, takes them back to their area to eat. Again, this is handled by the school board and their cafeteria folks. Just additional consider, we already talked about the isolation care area. There should not be a children's play area. Normally we would set up some area to keep the kids entertained, but in a COVID environment, that's not going to be possible. They should stay with their families and stay separate. Residents should not share items between themselves, things like books or magazines or things. They should keep everything that they have to themselves, and it's sort of a natural human instinct that says, oh, here's something, I'll share it with you. But in a COVID environment, everybody keeps to themselves. If there are any other entrances to the shelter, they must be staffed by someone to make sure that there's no entry or egress and that everybody's coming through and everybody's getting screened. And as far as additional resources like toilets, showers, most of the schools have enough toilets to serve the population, and evacuation, you're not going to bring those in. Longer term, these are considerations that we would have for, do we need to bring extra showers or shower trailers or things like that. Again, nobody can tell you what this fall is going to look like. There are changes to the CDC guidance. There'll probably be more. So at the time, check with your local emergency management for what the latest COVID-19 guidance is. The space per person may change. Last year, we were recommending 110 square feet per person for sheltering. That just was not very practical. This year, we're recommending 60. But at a certain time, you may have to adjust that based upon the hazard. It's much more important to get people in away from the threat. And again, much depends on current conditions at the time. I saw a couple of things pop up, I think, in the chat.
Yes, one is, will Wi-Fi be available at the shelters? That one is tricky because most of these are going to be at schools. So if there is Wi-Fi, it is likely going to be password protected Wi-Fi. So we cannot guarantee Wi-Fi will be available at shelters. We do know that we will have hotspots for staff inputting data into the registration forms and web EOC boards, but it is very iffy on if you will have access to Wi-Fi at a shelter. The next question is asking if we can advise to see if somebody will stop by and review a facility. And Elizabeth, if you actually shoot me an email, I'll get with you offline on that.
All right, closing the shelter. There needs to be a plan, and again, the administrators of the schools have that plan, but you're always looking towards the goal of closing the shelter. We try to give residents at least 24 hours notice before we close. And again, that's giving updates. So when you know about when that's going to occur, it's good to get that information out so residents can begin planning. We'll also be working with your county emergency management to talk about transfer of shelters and getting our post-storm shelters up and running. There is some delay in that because we have to do an inventory of what's available post-storm and what's habitable. But we'll work on them on that coordination. The schools, again, they have their custodial staff that work to get everything returned to its preconditions, but you may be asked to help a little bit with some minor cleaning and some movement of light furniture and getting people back in place. And again, that registration paperwork needs to get to that sheltering lead, whoever that is, and that information secured. And again, I thank you for your time and attention. Sheltering is not rocket science, but it's not easy. And it's really just learning to deal with people and problem solving. If you keep a good attitude, a positive attitude, it'll be a much better experience for you and the residents. So subject to your questions, that concludes my presentation.
And I did just want to remind everybody again, before you sign off, please put your first and last name in the chat box. If you are unable to do so, please send me an email right away so that I can mark you as here. There is one question, Steve. It says, are tents for large families allowed?
Inside of the shelter?
I believe that's what they're referring to.
Okay.
I think so. That was just the extent of the question.
Haven't really run into that. Again, our post-storm sheltering, we have cots and families. We do allow families to like pull their cots together, and we try to set up family areas for them. Because of space considerations, bringing a structure like a tent inside, we discourage that because it could get in the way. Just as a side, especially in Western states, people camp a lot out there. So our shelter, like for wildfires, our sheltering actually looks an awful lot like a campground because people will elect to stay outside and set up camps and then use the interior for feeding and restrooms and showers and things like that. Of course, you can't do that in a hurricane, but I would discourage it unless there was some benefit to the family or benefit to the shelter management to having it there.
To add on to that, don't forget that everybody does have a limited amount of space that they are provided within a shelter for each family group. So anything that's going to exceed that space capacity that they are provided is going to be discouraged as well. Are there any more questions at this time for the group? All right, with that being said, you guys can expect to get a recording of this training as well as a survey and your certifications, and then the shelter field guide as well. They'll likely be sent out either later on today or tomorrow morning. If you have any questions, please shoot me an email. My email's at the top of the chat box for everybody. Other than that, you guys all have a great day.
Thank you all. Have a great day.